name is Mario Eftimiopoulos. I'm the president of Strategy International. Let me welcome you for yet a second day for this very interesting conference. May I also thank you because this is the weekend. So I know how difficult it is for you to take some time off your busy schedule to be here. Before I go on with the actual program itself, again, I would like to thank our sponsors and our friends, Sakulas Publication, for all these very nice folders and paperwork and all these banners that have made for us. Allow me to thank also the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO Public Diplomacy. Allow me to thank our U.S. colleagues, the U.S. Embassy and Consulate. Allow me also to thank the French Consulate and their support, but also to thank our distinguished colleagues that came from Turkey and Bulgaria for being here, and our friends from and speakers from Hungary, from Albania, from Bulgaria, and Greece. This is a very distinguished panel of young professionals, academics with very much experience and good experience. I think this is a very important panel for the start of this day. And it will follow the discussion that was said, that was initiated yesterday morning and during the whole day on the development and opportunities for the new security challenges, for the North Atlantic view for the Mediterranean and Southeastern Europe, and in the end, by looking on the future of security and the future of social networks, smart diplomacy, and smart defense. So let me introduce to you our next panel of speakers. They will be talking about the transatlantic relations through regional cooperation, local investment, and global development. We will start with Professor Miltos Sarigiannidis. Miltos Sarigiannidis is a lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Aristotle. He will be talking to us about international organizations as factors of stability and social justice. That is a success story. I will not take any more time introducing Professor Sarigiannidis. Let me welcome him, and I'll give the floor. Each of our speakers will have 15 minutes, and then once we finish all the panel, we'll take a period of Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Well, international organizations as factors of stability and social justice seems to be rather a theoretical topic. And it is, just because I don't have any success story to tell you about this issue. Not that there aren't actually success stories, there are, but you cannot actually argue that there are stories full of success and glorious moments concerning the application of the principle of social justice, or even any achievement concerning stability, thanks to the role of international organizations. Now, I will focus upon a set of ideas and basic principles that emerge from the United Nations, especially from the United Nations Charter. And I will try to show that despite the fact that international organizations do not have enough power, real power, in order to impose, in order to materialize ideas, noble ideas like social justice, they do try to do so. Now, the United Nations Charter makes no explicit distinction between international justice and social justice. Or we could say justice among nations and justice among people. The Charter treats justice as a broad principle that ought to be applied in international relations. In the preamble and in Article 1 of the UN Charter, justice is associated with respect for international law. In Article 2, justice is linked to the sovereign equality of all members and to the maintenance of international peace and security. The reference to peace and equality of nations imply that each state should refrain from any use of force that may jeopardize or undermine the territorial integrity or political independence of another. Another implication is that the United Nations should not intervene in matters that fall essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of member states. That is Article 2, paragraph 7, except to enforce measures adopted by the Security Council in line with the provisions set out in Chapter 7. Furthermore, the one country, one vote rule in the General Assembly is a visible manifestation of the organization's recognition of sovereign equality. Thus, the conceptualization of justice is fundamentally associated to the principles of sovereign equality, non-intervention, and equal voting rights. By mid-60s, another dimension of international justice had taken shape with the colonization of a number of countries. The United Nations assumed increasing responsibility for helping the newly independent member states in their efforts to achieve economic and social progress. Gradually, the concept of development was substituted for the early emphasis on progress and evolved into a core component of the organization's mandate. International cooperation for development and the Nouvelle Ordre Économique was placed next to the maintenance of peace and security as a second pillar upon which the activities of the United Nations were based, the main objective being to narrow and ultimately close the gap between developed and developing countries. The efforts to bridge the distance separating poor and affluent nations are understood as the developmental aspects of international justice, that is, social justice. I would argue that the fundamental and finest universal text encompassing social justice is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in its preamble, states that, and I quote, "The highest aspiration of the common people is the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want, and associates recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family with freedom, justice, and peace in the world." The Declaration, in its 30 articles, essentially provides a catalogue of human rights, and in Article 29 and elsewhere, various duties, the respect and fulfillment of which shall bring justice to the peoples of the world. Whether stated in the positive, that is, everyone is entitled to, or everyone has the right to, or everyone has the duties to, or in the negative, no one shall be held in slavery, or no one should be subjected to torture or to arbitrary arrest. These rights and duties are addressed to all members of the human family and are inalienable. In the two international human rights instruments, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, that signed something like 20 years later, we can find same provisions elaborated and same ideas further furnished. But as a term, social justice is not referred neither in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights nor in the two covenants of 1966. Social justice first appeared in United Nations texts in the second half of the 60s. At the initiative of the Soviet Union, and with the support of developing countries, the term was used in the Declaration on Social Progress and Development adopted in 1969. 5 years later, it appeared in the Charter of the Economic Rights and Duties of States. Chapter 1 of this charter includes a list of 15 principles that should govern relations between states, and a few of these are particularly relevant in the present context. The 13th principle is a promotion of international social justice. The first is sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states. And the 11th one is a respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. By the time the latter text came out, social justice was a familiar concept in those parts of the UN Secretariat involved in social affairs. The Social Commission, one of the first subsidiary bodies of the Economic and Social Council, had become the Commission for Social Development. And although social justice, equality, and equity were sometimes defined as distinct concepts, they were more often used loosely and interchangeably. For the United Nations, international equality is both a guiding principle and a central objective. According to Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, the specified purposes of the organization and its members must be pursued in accordance with certain principles. The first of these principles emphasizes that the basis of the organization is a sovereign equality of all its members. The United Nations, by virtue of the near universality of its membership, its respect for the one country, one vote rule within the General Assembly, and its very existence, represents the supreme expression and guardian of the sovereign equality of states on which the contemporary understanding of international relations is based. The Charter also acknowledges that the world is characterized by a very unequal distribution of power, and therefore the responsibility and its form of responsibility along with force, and it is from this fact that the concept of international equity emerges. The principles of equality and equity at the international level have also guided United Nations efforts to promote development, which is defined in the preamble of the Charter as social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. And the presumption is that international cooperation is a moral imperative necessary for the reduction of inequalities between states. In this context, equality demands the participation of all states in the debates and negotiations required for effective international cooperation, while equity requires that the more affluent members of the international community express their solidarity through the provision of assistance, first through multilateral channels to the poorer members. Equity further demands the international cooperation be built upon processes, rules, and agreements that give preference and advantages to the weakest, and not based on the equal treatment of partners that are, objectively speaking, very unequal. Recalling these essential principles of international equality and equity embodied in the culture and mandate of the United Nations portrays the difficulties and uncertainties of the organization that is currently facing. Each member state still has one vote, but the General Assembly does not have much influence on decisions shaping world affairs. When critical issues are raised within the General Assembly, the practice of securing a consensus prevalent since the beginning of the 1980s gives de facto veto power to the most influential members. The Security Council has become the only visible arm of the organization. Reforms that would establish a more equitable composition and decision-making process have long been pending, at least during the last decade. Contempt for international law and the conviction that violence and war, despite their illegitimacy, are effective ways to pursue interests, resolve differences, and maintain security have resurfaced with formidable strength. The related idea that raw competition between all players in